Are you like me, pretending to be a curator at a fancy library? Can't stop buying books about foraging and herbalism, cookbooks, nature books, or just that cute book you bought because it has a mushroom on the cover? If you want to build an awesome library, don't let me stop you. We're obviously on the same path, but if your goal is to become a better forager, buying a ton of books is the wrong approach. Hi, I'm Orion. I've been a forager for most of my life and a wild food educator for the last 10 years. My goal on this channel is to create a connection to nature through food by either teaching you how to forage or by creating inspiration through my cooking. Books have been a major part of my lifelong foraging journey, and after a lot of trial and error, I think I figured out the best way to use them to become a better forager. Having too many can be a little bit overwhelming when you're just getting started, kind of like drinking through a fire hose. Instead, my advice is to choose 3 or 4 types of books and just focus on those first. Then you can build up your library. Before we get into the details, I did want to mention that I will have some specific recommendations that you'll be able to find links to in the description, but my advice for you would be to look for the most regionally relevant books you can find. That will help narrow down the information that you're ingesting and really focus in on your local plant and mushroom communities. Here are the 3 or 4 types of books I would recommend starting with: a plant book, a mushroom book, a tree book, and a wild food cookbook. The plant, mushroom, and tree books are going to be used pretty similarly, with a little caveat for the tree book that I'll get into later. Most people seem to use foraging books as an identification guide, so they will find something, bring it inside, and see if they can match it up in the book. But there's a better approach. The first thing you should do when you get a new foraging book is sit down and read through the whole thing. This is especially useful if you can find some of those regionally specific books that I mentioned earlier. By reading the books, not only are you adding to your knowledge right away, but you're also building up unconscious patterns in your brain that will help you when you're out in the field foraging and walking through nature. Our brains love to look for patterns in things. We go through our entire lives making decisions just based off patterns that our brains are subconsciously looking through and matching to memories. This is called pattern recognition, and it's also really important for wild foods and foraging. By reading through the book when you get them, your brains are learning the descriptions and seeing pictures of the plants and mushrooms in your area and storing those for later. I promise if you do this, you will surprise yourself at some point while you're out in the field. Your brain will recognize a plant that you didn't even know that you knew. You're also creating a foundation that you can build upon as you move through your foraging journey. Stacking layers upon layers of information and patterns and species creates more reference for your brain, so you can compare new species to those and make some decisions on identifications or where they fit into their family groups, just based off what you have in your memory. The final thing I want to mention about some of these plant and mushroom books is that they occasionally will contain something called a dichotomous key. This isn't in all foraging books, but the ones that do have them are another useful resource for you. It gives you 2 traits to compare. So for instance, if you're trying to identify a mushroom, it might say brown cap, red cap. And then it becomes a sort of choose your own adventure path as you make your way through the key, choosing traits that match closest until you end up at a species or at least something near the species you have. Now, like I said, you can use tree books in a similar way. Read through them, get used to your local species. The only thing I should mention is that there aren't many foraging specific tree books out there, so you're just going to be looking for tree guides. There are trees with a ton of really great edible parts that we can forage, but you'll have to learn those from a different resource until more options come out for tree foraging specifically. Outside of foraging for trees, there are 2 really important reasons why you would want to know your tree identification. The first is that trees can help you figure out what habitats you're in and guide you to other wild foods you're looking for. For instance, if you're seeing a lot of cottonwoods and willows in the west, that means you're probably in a river habitat, which would have a lot of wild greens and some specific mushroom species. And speaking of mushrooms, knowing your tree identification when you're mushroom foraging is like a superpower. So many of the mushroom species that we're looking for are mycorrhizal, meaning that they have a symbiotic relationship with the trees, and if you can identify the trees, you can often find the mushrooms you're looking for. One really good example of this that's more relevant to my local area of Colorado and the Southern Rockies are porcini mushrooms, which are mycorrhizal with spruce and fir. So if you can identify spruce and fir trees, you can often find the right habitats for porcini mushrooms. I think tree identification is an underutilized skill by a lot of foragers, and I would really recommend adding this into your first few books when you're learning how to forage. The other type of book I would recommend is a wild food cookbook. There are tons of great cookbooks out there. I have many, but a cookbook specific to wild foods will help you become more comfortable using these new ingredients. Using wild foods in the kitchen is something that a lot of new foragers struggle with, myself included when I was new. And it seems to be because these ingredients are unusual and unique and we don't have previous experience or standardized recipes for a lot of them. And so a wild food cookbook can help you start to figure out where these ingredients best fit into your cooking. So my suggestion is to pick a good wild food cookbook. Again, I'll have some links to my favorites in the description. Read through that to see how the author is using these ingredients in their cooking and how they're recommending that you use them, and then think about those as you're foraging. The other trick you can do that I think really helps quite a bit is start subbing in foraged ingredients for other foraged ingredients in these recipes. For instance, if a recipe calls for a wild mustard green, maybe try switching it in with a non-mustard green. Or if a recipe calls for a specific fruit or berry, try using a different wild one instead. As you start mixing in ingredients that aren't specific to the recipe, you start becoming more comfortable with just using unique ingredients where you think they'll fit in a recipe and cooking with your heart and your instinct instead of following a recipe to the T. This process just generally makes you a better cook and more comfortable in the kitchen, and I would really recommend it. Once you're a little more comfortable with using these wild ingredients in your cooking, then I would recommend repeating the process with a standard cookbook, one that doesn't have wild ingredients in it. Just swap in wild ingredients where you think they would fit in the recipe and see what happens. I bet you'll be surprised. And speaking of cooking with wild foods, you can watch this video if you want to see how I use wild burdock to make kimpira gobo. I hope this video has given you some insight on how I would recommend using books to become better foragers. And if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.